The 1940s and 1950s in large cities like Chicago offer a fascinating look at how de facto segregation worked among the black and white populations. Visually, it was easy to see where each population resided. White neighborhoods often flourished with new developments and the latest amenities. Ghettos, on the other hand, were often overcrowded and in serious states of disrepair. However, even black families who could afford to move out of ghettos legally couldn't, thanks to racially restrictive covenants, which protected the so-called racial integrity of white neighborhoods. Legal agreements signed by members of white communities, each covenant forbade the sale or leasing of any house or property to anyone of the colored race. The covenants were officially challenged when Carl Hansberry, Lorraine Hansberry's father, bought a house in a white neighborhood and was consequently sued by their white neighbors for violating such a covenant, which in this case wasn't created until 1927. The case was taken up by attorneys working for the NAACP, and through multiple cases and complaints were able to bring it to the Supreme Court. Although it seems obvious to us now, the court chose not to evoke the 14th Amendment, which offered equal protection under the law. Instead, they decided to rule in favor of the Hansberrys based on findings proving that the original covenant the neighbors wished to enforce contains a contractual error which made it invalid. While it wasn't the sweeping victory in racial equality the Hansberrys were hoping for, it did open a number of doors for black families to move into nicer neighborhoods away from ghettos, and for racially restrictive covenants to be unraveled when brought under legal scrutiny. These covenants, in particular, used language that was designed to reinforce African Americans' social space within a white-dominated structure. As mentioned before, white housing was infinitely better, and within the covenants, they restricted blacks from access to these homes. They also chose to indicate that if a black wished to live in a white neighborhood, it had to be in subservient circumstances. They were allowed only in secondary structures, such as basements, barns, or sheds, and if they chose to live on a white property, it must be because they were in service of the white family who owned the property. This automatically placed them in roles such as maids, caregivers, chauffeurs, and drivers, and did not afford them the same equality that they deserved. In Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, her character Mama represents an older generation, one that wishes to break racial stereotypes but goes about it in a rather antiquated way. What Mama craves is a chance at a better life, one rooted in the ideals of the American dream, in which a nice home and a nice neighborhood are considered goals, not because of their material value, but because of the opportunities they provide their children in a white-dominated society that views material objects as markers of success that can then be used to break racial stereotypes. While Mama's hopes and dreams are admirable, they do tend to play into the structure that white society has already set up. As a result, her daughter, Benita, who represents the younger generation, tends to push back on how Mama handles this attack on racism. Benita is the perfect example of a young college student who has been enlightened to different philosophies and world events that have altered her view on racism. Looking to get away from the socially engineered system that white society has set up, in which the law is always to their advantage, Benita searches for more intangible ways to improve her life and advance her status in civil rights, mainly through things like a college education versus a property in a nice neighborhood. She also attempts to connect with the African side of her identity as a form of resistance against institutionalized racism, in a struggle for what W.E.B. Du Bois termed as double consciousness. Aware of their African heritage that has eroded with time, yet raised in a staunchly American society, Du Bois argued that each African American must deal with the dual sides of their identity and attempt to merge the two into a cohesive manner. The older generation, as represented by Mama, displayed little desire in connecting with their native roots, instead seeking to gain equality through the attainment of tangible improvements, like a nicer house and a nicer neighborhood. This action would, in their eyes, redefine the social space assigned to them, and thus assert their racial identity as equal to that of whites. The younger generation, as represented by Benita, did display an interest in their African heritage in a similar attempt to redefine their social space, looking to intangible improvements like education as an avenue of asserting their equal but distinctly different racial identity.
To be a man is not equivalent as to be male. describing an individual as manly or masculine goes beyond simple description in applying a subtle positive evaluation. This attribution of ideal characteristics is mostly limited to those of the male gender, but importantly, it's not inherent to the male gender. Instead, to be a man is a standard to which men are constantly compared and forever trying to maintain. The characteristics of what it means to be a man are easily identifiable from popular culture. The tautological, manly man is tough, courageous, reliable, and in control of himself and others. Some argue that a modern crisis of masculinity is Western cultural rejection of the archetypal manly man. Academics such as Harvey Mansfield argue that the concept of manliness is a quality our gender-neutral society does not like but cannot get rid of. And the argument is that manliness is actually a concrete human construction that has evolutionary benefits and is represented by confidence in a situation of risk. For those holding this understanding of masculinity, it's an aspirational and transcendental status that is actually a useful concept for promoting positive behaviors of confidence and independence. The idea of manning up emerges from this conception, that men make a sacrifice of a preferable passivity in favor of a more risky but active confidence, which is argued to be objectively laudable. Social scientists have tried to quantify how men seek this masculine status. In a 2013 study, men and women were asked to identify features associated with masculine and feminine characteristics. Random participants were then given feedback that their responses indicated a feminine or masculine response. All respondents were then given a survey on current events. Men who were given feedback that their responses were feminine consequently expressed greater support for war, homophobic attitudes, and interest in purchasing an SUV. The results of this study demonstrate how men worry about their masculinity and the extent to which they will attempt to signal otherwise when their masculinity is threatened. The pressure for men to be masculine is the cause of many crises in real and fictional lives. A Raisin in the Sun demonstrates through the stage a man's struggle to succeed in achieving this status. Walter Lee Jr. is a man who is unable to provide for his family in the way that he would like. The poor family featured in A Raisin in the Sun is going to be uplifted by the life insurance check of Walter Lee Sr. Even in death, Walter Jr.'s father is better able to materially provide for his family. Walter Jr. demonstrates his frustration in the first scene over breakfast with his wife Ruth.
Eat your eggs, you're going to be cold.
See? The man say to his woman, I got me a dream. She says, eat your eggs, they getting cold. Man say to his woman, help me now to take a hold in this world somehow, and she says, eat your eggs and go to work. I tell you, I gotta change my life because I'm choking to death, and all you say to me is eat these eggs.
Walter?
A lack of agency, the ability to do something, is the crux of Walter Jr.'s frustration. He does not believe he can realize his masculinity without being the kind of material provider for his family he wants to be. The realities of poverty and racial discrimination in 1950s Chicago prevent him from actively changing his status. This crisis drives Walter Jr. to fail his family, into losing the majority of the life insurance check, and almost giving in to Mr. Linder's request to buy their new house. These rash decisions are driven by Walter Jr.'s desire to achieve masculinity.
The battle of restrictive covenants begins in the Supreme Court with Corrigan v. Buckley in 1926. The courts acknowledged that these covenants existed and stated that the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments did nothing to preclude private landowners from signing these covenants. In Buckley, the court also ruled that these amendments only applied to the state and not individuals. If you ask the Hansberrys, they would never admit to this legal battle and Hansberry v. Lee being a full win for them. The Hansberrys' home in Chicago was consistently a target. Lorraine Hansberry described her neighborhood as being, quote, hellishly hostile. The Illinois Supreme Court originally ruled against the Hansberrys, but thanks to the United States Supreme Court, they ruled that African Americans could not be precluded from neighborhoods because of their race. The Supreme Court focused this case on the contestability of the covenant, not the legality. Whenever polled, only 54% of the residents agreed with or supported the covenant. The Supreme Court also gave the parties involved hints to contest the covenant again. Ultimately, the decision led to many homes in Chicago being opened up to people of African American descent. 8 years later, while Lorraine Hansberry was enrolled at the University of Wisconsin, getting involved in theater, the university papers, the local Communist Party, and fights to end racial segregation, the Supreme Court gave the Hansberrys their win. They decided in Shelley v. Kramer the legal win the Hansberrys were looking for. These covenants were in fact a violation of the 14th Amendment, and hence they were impermissible and could not be enforced in court. In 1959, A Raisin in the Sun was released on Broadway and was highly acclaimed. This play was the first production to appear on Broadway from an African-American female writer. Because of her connection with the Communist Party, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had agents attend A Raisin in the Sun's opening night. The Bureau even had thousands of pages detailing and critiquing the work of prominent African-American writers of the time. Lorraine Hansberry died January 12th of 1965 of pancreatic cancer. Her funeral, 3 days later, attracted the attention of figures such as Malcolm X, Ossie Davis, and Diana Sands. It even featured a telegram from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.